What would you do if the candlelight illuminating your evening prayers came from something unspeakable? If the gentle flame that guided your children to bed was fueled by the rendered fat of the dead, not animals, but humans? If an entire town unknowingly participated in an act of desecration so profound that it transformed their most sacred rituals into unwitting blasphemy? Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing cases of hidden horror in colonial American history. But before we descend into the darkness of this impossible crime, I need you to ask yourself, what makes something truly sacred? Is it the intention or the substance, the prayer or the object that illuminates it? Tell us where you're watching from right now and whether you believe ignorance absolves guilt, because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about complicity, about the objects we trust, and about how something monstrous can hide in plain sight for years, burning in every window, melting on every table, glowing in every church. This episode contains detailed descriptions of death, body desecration, and psychological horror. The details included serve understanding, not sensationalism, but they are disturbing. This content discusses real historical events involving loss of life. We present these accounts with profound respect for those who suffered and died. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. In the archives of Salem, Massachusetts, there exists a ledger that shouldn't exist. A Chandler's account book from 1729, with entries that document purchases in pounds and shillings, but with source materials listed simply as special tallow, private procurement. Standard enough for the era, except for one detail discovered during restoration in 1998. Beneath the faded ink, ultraviolet analysis revealed original entries that had been meticulously scratched out and rewritten. The original words, barely visible but unmistakable: Potter's Field yield and almshouse surplus. And, most chillingly, graveyard harvest, 12 pounds rendered. We're about to delve into a mystery that haunted a community for 3 decades, where one man's unspeakable trade transformed mourning into violation, where the dead were robbed not of valuables but of their very substance, leaving families to unknowingly light their homes with the remains of neighbors, strangers, perhaps even their own lost children. This isn't just a story about the past. This is a question about trust, about the invisible crimes that occur in the spaces between our awareness, about how evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply melts, drips, and burns away the evidence. It was the year 1700. The new century had arrived with brutal cold across the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the worst winter in living memory that would later be called the Great Snow. Settlers were dying from exposure, from starvation, from diseases that thrived in the weakened bodies of the desperate. The death rate in Salem had tripled, and with it came an overwhelming demand for one essential commodity in those endless winter nights: candles. Light, the ability to push back darkness for just a few more hours. But in this season of death and desperate need, one man saw opportunity. One man understood that in a world where bodies were plentiful and questions were few, where the dead were buried quickly in frozen ground and rarely exhumed, where poverty meant that paupers were interred in anonymous graves with little ceremony and less supervision, certain economies were possible. What the townspeople of Salem didn't know, what they couldn't know as they purchased their weekly allotment of candles from Josiah Croaker's chandlery, was that they weren't just buying light. They were buying the dead, and they had been for years. Salem in 1700 was a town that had learned to live with ghosts. Just 8 years had passed since the witch trials had torn the community apart, leaving scars that ran deeper than any physical wound. 19 executed, dozens imprisoned, families destroyed, trust shattered. The town existed in a state of collective shame, a community trying desperately to move forward while knowing that the ground beneath their feet held secrets, accusations, and innocents who had died, screaming their denials. But there was another kind of ghost in Salem, the kind that no one talked about because they were too common, too expected, too mundane to merit much attention: the poor dead. In those years, Salem maintained what was euphemistically called a potter's field, an anonymous burial ground at the edge of town where the destitute, the unclaimed, the unwanted were laid to rest in unmarked graves, paupers who died in the almshouse, strangers who succumbed to disease while passing through, infants who died before baptism, the mentally afflicted who had no families willing to claim them, bodies donated by families too poor to afford a proper burial, criminals whose families wanted no association with them even in death. These were the invisible dead, the forgotten, the ones who passed from life to earth with barely a witness. And this is where our story truly begins, not with a murder, but with an absence of oversight, an absence of records, an absence of anyone who cared enough to count. The chandlery stood on Fisher Street, a narrow thoroughfare that connected the prosperous center of Salem to the working docks. It was a building that seemed to lean slightly, as if weary from decades of smoke and heat. The windows were perpetually glazed with condensation, making it impossible to see clearly inside. The door was heavy oak, swollen from humidity that groaned when pushed open, and always there was the smell. If you had asked the townspeople about Josiah Croaker's chandlery, they would have told you it smelled like any tallow works, animal fat being rendered, the acrid smoke of burning impurities, the waxy sweetness of cooling candles, the underlying note of rot that comes from working with dead things. Unpleasant, certainly, but no more so than the tannery or the slaughterhouse. This was the smell of industry, of necessity, of civilization pushing back against the darkness. But there was something else in that smell, something that people couldn't quite identify, a heaviness, a sweetness that wasn't quite right, a note that lingered in the nostrils long after you left the shop, that clung to your clothing, that seemed to seep into your very skin. Most dismissed it, some found it unsettling, a few refused to enter the shop at all, though they couldn't articulate why. One woman, Margaret Downing, told her husband in 1727 that the smell reminded her of her father's deathbed, that particular odor of a body beginning its final surrender. Her husband dismissed her sensitivity as female hysteria. She continued to send their servant to purchase candles rather than entering the shop herself. Years later, during the trial, she would weep on the witness stand, saying simply, "I knew. Somehow I knew. But most didn't know. Most couldn't conceive of such a thing." Josiah Croaker was 40, 3 years old in 1700, though he looked older. The work aged a man. The constant heat, the acrid smoke, the physical labor of rendering fat and pouring molds. He was thin to the point of gauntness, which struck some as odd given that chandlers usually showed the comfortable girth of men who worked around plentiful food sources. His hands were perpetually stained, the lines of his palms dark with residue that no amount of washing could remove. His eyes were pale blue, watery, the kind that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He lived alone above the shop, a widower who rarely engaged in the social life of the town. His wife, Elizabeth, had died in 1690, for, in childbirth, the child had died as well. Some said he had never recovered from the loss. Others whispered that he had been strange even before, that Elizabeth had been one of those gentle souls who saw goodness where none existed. The truth, as is often the case, was more complicated. Croaker had inherited the chandlery from his father in 1689. The elder Croaker had been a respected tradesman, known for quality work and fair prices. But the business had been struggling in those final years before the witch trials, as cheaper tallow from Boston flooded the market. When Josiah took over, the consensus was that the chandlery would likely fail within a few years. It didn't fail. In fact, it thrived. By 1700, Croaker's chandlery was the largest supplier of candles in Salem and the surrounding villages. His prices were lower than his competitors, yet his candles burned longer, cleaner, with less smoke and drip. Church officials praised them for their purity. Wealthy merchants ordered them in bulk for their counting houses. Even the poor could afford a few of Croaker's candles for essential evening work. How did he do it? When asked, Croaker would smile his thin smile and say, "Careful procurement of materials, attention to detail, the Lord's blessing on honest labor." The truth was far simpler and far more horrible. Human fat renders at a lower temperature than animal tallow. It produces a cleaner burn, less smoke, less odor, a purer white color, and in 1700 Salem, it was freely available to anyone willing to commit the unspeakable act of harvesting it. The pattern began simply enough. In the winter of 1695, during an outbreak of winter fever that killed dozens in the almshouse, Croaker made his first approach to Thomas Welks, the grave digger responsible for Potter's Field. Welks was 57, alcoholic, bitter about his station in life, and perpetually in need of money to feed his vice. He was also the only person in Salem who knew exactly how many bodies went into Potter's Field, when they went in, and in what condition. The conversation, as Welks would later testify, happened in a tavern. Croaker bought him drinks. They spoke of business, of hard times, of the difficulty of making ends meet. Then, carefully, Croaker mentioned that he had use for certain materials that the grave digger might be able to provide. Materials that would otherwise go to waste in the ground. Animal carcasses, Croaker had said, though they both knew he meant something else. From the almshouse, from the fields, from anywhere, fresh is better, but I can work with anything. Welks understood immediately. Later, he would claim he was drunk, that he didn't comprehend what was truly being proposed. But his testimony also revealed that Croaker offered him 2 shillings per body, nearly a week's wages for Welks. For a man drowning in drink, it was an impossible sum to refuse. I told myself they were already dead. Welks said during his confession in 1730, "I told myself it didn't matter, that they were paupers, that no one cared, that the body was just meat once the soul departed. I told myself many things. They were all lies I needed to believe." The arrangement was simple. When a body came to Potter's Field for burial, especially the poor, the unclaimed, the forgotten, Welks would notify Croaker. If the body was fresh enough, if the timing was right, if the risk was minimal, Croaker would come after dark with a cart. They would exhume the body. Croaker would take it to the chandlery. Within a week, the rendered fat would be mixed with legitimate tallow, stretched with other materials, transformed into candles. The body, what remained of it, would be reburied in Potter's Field, sometimes in the same grave, but often not. Sometimes scattered, sometimes weighted and sunk in the marshes outside town. The graves, after all, were unmarked. Who would know, who would check, who would care? For the first few years, Croaker was cautious. He took only occasional bodies. Only the freshest, only when Welks assured him the risk was minimal. Only paupers who had no family, no friends, no one who might ask questions about the burial. But as the years passed and no questions came, as his business grew and his candles earned praise throughout the colony, as the money accumulated and the risk seemed to evaporate, Croaker became bolder. By 1710, he was taking an average of 8 bodies per year. By 1720, that number had grown to 15. By 1728, the year before his discovery, Josiah Croaker had rendered the fat from 43 human corpses, transforming them into approximately 970 2 pounds of tallow, which in turn became thousands upon thousands of candles. The arithmetic of atrocity is always shocking in its banality. But let's pause here. Let's talk about what we think we know versus what the evidence actually shows. Most accounts of this case focus on the horror of the act itself, the desecration, the violation, the macabre nature of human fat being rendered and sold. And yes, that horror is real and profound. But that's not where the true darkness lies. The true darkness is this. For nearly 30 years, an entire community participated unknowingly in the desecration of their dead. For 30 years, families mourned by candlelight, never knowing they were burning their own. For 30 years, churches held services, ministers preached salvation, congregations sang hymns, all illuminated by the rendered fat of paupers, criminals, unbaptized infants, and the forgotten poor. The true darkness is that this was only possible because a community had created categories of dead, worthy and unworthy, remembered and forgotten, sacred and disposable. The true darkness is that when the crime was finally discovered, the initial public outrage wasn't about the act itself, but about who the victims were. When it was believed that only paupers had been violated, the horror was abstract, philosophical. But when evidence emerged suggesting that Croaker may have taken bodies from proper graveyards, that wealthy families might have been affected, that's when the town truly erupted in fury. The question we should be asking isn't just how could he do this? The question is, how did we create a world where this was possible? The first crack in Croaker's decades, long secret, appeared in the spring of 1729, and it came from an unexpected source, a child's nightmare. Rebecca Ames was 9 years old, the daughter of a successful merchant. The family lived in a well-appointed house on Essex Street, with fine furniture, imported fabrics, and shelves full of books, a mark of considerable wealth in colonial America. They were, by all accounts, a pious family, attending church 3 times weekly, observing all holy days, raising their children in proper fear of God. Rebecca's bedroom was on the 2nd floor, facing the street. Like all colonial bedrooms, it was perpetually cold in winter, drafty even in summer. The family kept candles burning in her room at night, both for warmth and to ward off the darkness that terrified her. In March of 1729, Rebecca began having nightmares, terrible dreams of people standing around her bed, watching her sleep. Not threatening exactly, just watching, waiting. In her dreams they were pale, their skin waxy, their eyes hollow. They didn't speak. They simply stood there, illuminated by flickering light, watching her with expressions of profound sadness. At first her parents dismissed it as childish fancy. Bad dreams were common. They increased prayers at bedtime, added Bible readings, consulted with their minister about spiritual protection for the child. The nightmares intensified. Rebecca began to describe the watchers in greater detail. There was a woman in a gray dress with no buttons, a man with a crooked neck, a baby that wasn't breathing, an old man with dirt in his hair. They stood around her bed every night, she said, and they smelled like the candles. That detail struck her mother as odd. Smelled like the candles, like when the candles are burning, Rebecca insisted. That sweet smell, they smell the same. Sarah Ames began to pay attention to the candles in her daughter's room. They were Croaker's candles. The family purchased them in bulk, as did most of Salem. She had never noticed anything unusual about them before. Good quality, clean burn, pleasant enough. But now, prompted by her daughter's strange statement, she began to notice something. A sweetness in the smoke, yes, but beneath it, something else. Something that reminded her of what? She couldn't quite place it. It gnawed at her awareness. Then, in early April, Rebecca stopped sleeping entirely. She would scream if her parents tried to light candles in her room. The nightmares, she said, were getting worse. The people were trying to tell her something, but she couldn't understand them. They were angry that she was burning them. Burning them? Her father asked. What does that mean? Rebecca pointed at the candles. There in the candles. She said simply, had to leave the cellar to vomit. They're in the candles, and we're burning them, and they want us to stop. Any other time, in any other town, this would have been dismissed as a child's disturbed imagination, perhaps exacerbated by illness or stress. But this was Salem. Salem, where less than 40 years earlier, children's nightmares and strange accusations had led to mass hysteria, to trials, to executions. Salem had learned, brutally, to take children's warnings seriously. Sarah Ames told her husband. Her husband, deeply unsettled, mentioned it to another merchant. Word spread, as it does in small communities, transforming with each retelling. A child having visions, claiming the dead were in the candles, Croaker's candles specifically. Within 2 weeks, 3 other families reported similar disturbances in their homes. Children having nightmares, servants refusing to enter rooms where Croaker's candles burned, a particularly sensitive woman claiming she could smell death in the candle smoke. Hysteria, perhaps, collective delusion, possibly, or perhaps, as sometimes happens, the unconscious mind perceives what the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. Perhaps some part of these people knew that something was wrong, had always known, but lacked the framework to name it. On April 23, 1729, 3 selectmen of Salem town officials elected to oversee community affairs paid a visit to Josiah Croaker's chandlery. They came with questions about his sources of tallow, about his production methods, about how he managed to produce such quantity at such low prices, about the smell that some citizens found unsettling, about the child's nightmares and the strange claims. Croaker welcomed them into his shop with his usual thin smile. He showed them his rendering vats, his molds, his storage barrels. He explained his techniques, his suppliers, his business practices. Everything appeared normal, if unpleasant. This was tallow work, after all, inherently involving dead flesh and rendering fat. The selectmen found nothing suspicious. They concluded that the complaints were the result of overactive imaginations, residual anxiety from the witch trial years, perhaps even deliberate slander from competitors jealous of Croaker's success. They left satisfied that Josiah Croaker was simply a skilled tradesman being unfairly maligned by rumor. But one of them, Nathaniel Hale, couldn't quite let it go. Hale was 60, 2 years old, a veteran of King Philip's War, a man who had seen enough of human nature to know that evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs. He had been one of the few voices of moderation during the witch trials, had argued against spectral evidence, had begged his fellow townsmen to require concrete proof before condemning their neighbors. He had failed then. Innocents had died. He would not fail again. Hale began to investigate quietly. He started with the one person who would know the truth, Thomas Welks, the grave digger. What Hale discovered would shatter Salem once again. But this time the horror was real. This time the evidence was not spectral testimony or hysteria, but cold, physical, undeniable fact. This time the monster was not imagined. He was very, very real, and he had been hiding in plain sight, burning in every window for 30 years. On May 7, 1729, Nathaniel Hale found Thomas Welks in his usual state, drunk, bitter, and more than willing to talk in exchange for coin and sympathy. The conversation began innocently enough. Hale asked about burial practices, about how many paupers were interred each year, about record keeping. Welks, his tongue loosened by rum, was surprisingly forthcoming. Too forthcoming. He mentioned casually that the number of burials in Potter's Field had declined significantly in recent years, despite the population growing and death rates remaining steady. Used to be 30-40 paupers a year. Welks said, his words slurring, now it's hardly a dozen. Don't know where they all go. Where they go? Hale asked carefully. Welks realized his mistake immediately. His face paled. He tried to backtrack, to change the subject, to excuse himself. But Hale was persistent, and Welks was a weak man who had been carrying a terrible secret for 34 years. The burden of it had been killing him as surely as the drink. I need to confess, Welks finally said, and began to weep. I need to confess before I die, before I face God's judgment, before. What poured out of him over the next 3 hours would haunt Nathaniel Hale for the remainder of his life. Welks confessed everything, the arrangement with Croaker, the exhumations, the payments, the bodies, so many bodies. He didn't know the exact count, he said, but hundreds, maybe more. Paupers, criminals, stillbirths, unclaimed strangers. Fresh graves opened under cover of darkness. Bodies pulled from the earth and carted to the chandlery on Fisher Street. What happened to them? Hale asked, though part of him already knew, already understood the horrific truth. He rendered them, Welks whispered. Cut them up and rendered the fat like you would a pig, boiled it down, mixed it with regular tallow, made candles. We reburied what was left, but there wasn't much, bones mostly, sometimes not even that. Hale sat in silence for a long moment, feeling as if the ground beneath him had opened up. The candles burning in his own home. The candles that had illuminated his family's dinners, his evening prayers, his children's births. The candles in the church. The candles at funerals, oh God, the candles at funerals, burning while families mourned, never knowing they might be burning the dead they had just buried. How many? Hale asked quietly. I don't know exact. 300, 4, maybe more. We didn't keep count after a while. It became routine. The casual horror of that word, that desecration, had become routine, unremarkable, just another task in the day. Hale asked the question he had to ask, though he feared the answer. Were they all from Potter's Field, all paupers? Welks couldn't meet his eyes. Mostly, but in the lean times when there weren't enough paupers dying, Croaker would get, impatient, demanding, he'd pay extra for others. What others? The new graves, the ones in the proper cemetery, when a family couldn't afford a watcher, when a grave was fresh and unwatched. We took some of those too. The proper cemetery, where the respectable dead lay, where merchants and ministers and good Christian families buried their loved ones with prayers and headstones and the expectation of sanctity. How many, which ones, whose children, whose parents, whose spouses had been violated? Hale felt bile rise in his throat. I need you to come with me to the magistrate, he said finally. You need to testify to all of this, every detail, every body you can remember. Welks nodded, resigned to his fate. I know, I've known for years this day would come. Part of me has been waiting for it, wanting it. The dead don't let you forget, sir. They visit you, every night. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces, hundreds of faces, watching me, waiting for justice. Like Rebecca Ames's nightmares, Hale thought. The dead in the candles, watching, waiting. Perhaps the child had been right all along. The investigation that followed was conducted with unusual speed and thoroughness, driven by a community desperate to know the extent of the horror that had been perpetrated in their midst. On May 9th, armed with Welks's confession, magistrates obtained a warrant to search Josiah Croaker's chandlery and residence. They arrived before dawn, hoping to catch him unaware. They found him in his workshop, already at work despite the early hour. He showed no surprise at their arrival, no fear, no guilt. He simply watched them with those pale, watery eyes as they began their search. What they discovered in that chandlery would become the stuff of nightmares. The main workshop appeared normal enough, rendering vats, cooling racks, molds, barrels of tallow, stacks of finished candles. But in the cellar, behind a false wall that took investigators nearly an hour to locate, they found evidence that confirmed Welks's testimony and revealed the true scale of Croaker's operation. Account books, meticulous records dating back to 1695. Each entry documented a procurement, the date, the source, Potter's Field, or specific sections of the proper cemetery, the estimated weight of usable material, and the yield after rendering. The entries were written in Croaker's precise hand, clinical and detailed, describing human beings as if they were livestock. February 12, 1707, Potter's Field, male, aged approximately 40, winter fever, 42 pounds yielded, quality, excellent. June 3, 1715, New Cemetery, Section 4, infant, stillborn, 6 pounds yielded, quality, superior, very pure. November 18, 1722, almshouse, female, aged 65, consumption, 38 pounds yielded, mixed with goat tallow due to disease concerns. Each entry represented a person, someone's father, mother, child. Each entry represented a life that had ended, a body that should have rested in peace, a soul whose mortal remains had been harvested and sold. The investigators counted the entries. By the time they finished, they had documented 340, 7 individual procurements spanning 34 years. 340, 7 human beings rendered into tallow, transformed into candles, burned in the homes and churches and shops of Salem. But the account books weren't the worst discovery. In the far corner of the cellar, in barrels labeled bone meal and waste ash, they found the remains of Croaker's most recent procurements. Bones that had been boiled clean, skulls with the tops sawed off to extract brain matter, fragments of human tissue that hadn't fully rendered, bits of cloth, burial shrouds, dresses, the swaddling of infants. One investigator, a man named Jeremiah Frost, who had served as a soldier and witnessed the aftermath of Indian raids, had to leave the cellar to vomit. Later, he would testify that in all his years of war and violence, he had never seen anything that disturbed him as deeply as that cellar full of human remains reduced to industrial waste. It was the casualness of it, he said, the organization, the neat labels, the careful record keeping. He had systematized the desecration of the dead. He had turned horror into a business model. Josiah Croaker was arrested that morning. He offered no resistance. When asked if he understood the charges against him, desecration of corpses, theft of bodies, fraud, violation of Christian burial practices, he simply nodded. "Do you deny these acts?" the magistrate asked. "No," Croaker said calmly, "they are all true. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Croaker thought for a moment, then spoke words that would be recorded in court documents and repeated with horror for generations. "They were already dead. I gave them purpose. I gave them light. What use is fat to a corpse? What use is flesh when the soul has departed? I wasted nothing. The Lord abhors waste." The magistrate stared at him in disbelief. You rendered human beings into candles, you sold them. People burned the dead in their homes, in churches, unknowing. You see no sin in this. I see efficiency. Croaker replied. I see the use of materials that would otherwise rot uselessly in the ground. The dead care nothing for their bodies. I harmed no living person. You harmed the families who believed their loved ones rested in sanctity. You harmed the community's trust. You harmed the very concept of human dignity. Croaker shrugged. Dignity is for the living. The dead are meat and bone. I treated them no differently than one treats a slaughtered pig. This inability to recognize the moral dimension of his acts would characterize all of Croaker's statements during his imprisonment and trial. He wasn't insane. Multiple examinations confirmed that he understood reality, knew right from wrong by conventional standards, and was competent to stand trial. He simply didn't believe that his actions constituted a moral violation. In modern terms, we might recognize this as psychopathy, a profound inability to empathize, to grasp why his acts would horrify others, to understand the violation he had perpetrated. But in 1720, Salem, they had simpler language. They called him evil, pure, calculated, unrepentant evil. The community's response to the revelation was unlike anything Salem had experienced, even during the witch trials. This was different, this was real, this was provable, and this had affected everyone. Within days of Croaker's arrest, families began to panic about who might have been among his victims. The problem was that Welks could remember only general details about most of the body's approximate ages, causes of death, burial locations. He couldn't provide names for most of the paupers, because paupers often weren't recorded by name, and for the bodies taken from the proper cemetery, he could remember only vague locations. Section 4, near the oak tree, or the northwest corner, a small grave. Every family who had buried a loved one in the past 34 years had to wonder, were their dead among the violated? Had their father, their wife, their infant child been exhumed and rendered? Had they mourned by the light of their own family's remains? The magistrates ordered a systematic exhumation of Potter's Field and suspicious areas of the proper cemetery. The work took weeks. What they found was devastating in its ambiguity. Many graves were empty, disturbed, the caskets broken open, nothing inside but stained wood. Other graves contained partial remains, bones, but no soft tissue, or scattered fragments suggesting the body had been partially dismembered. Some graves contained bones that clearly belonged to multiple individuals, suggesting Croaker and Welks had reburied mixed remains to save time. But the worst graves were the ones that contained only burial shrouds, and sometimes bones suggesting the body had been completely removed, rendered entirely, with nothing left to return to the earth. A committee was established to attempt identification. They cross-referenced Croaker's account books with burial records, trying to match dates and descriptions to specific individuals. It was a nightmare of historical detective work, made worse by incomplete records and the passage of time. They were able to identify 89 victims by name with reasonable certainty, 89 people whose families could be told with confidence that their loved ones had been violated. The remaining 258 victims remained anonymous, forgotten in death as they had been in life. Among the identified victims, Sarah Fletcher, aged 19, died of childbed fever in 1707. Her husband, Jonathan Fletcher, learned that the wife he had buried with prayers and tears had been exhumed within a week of burial and rendered into tallow. He never recovered from the knowledge and died by his own hand in 1731. 3 unnamed infants from the almshouse, stillborn in 1715, whose bodies were taken before burial. No one had claimed them. No one knew their names. They existed only as entries in Croaker's ledger. 3 infants, combined yield 14 pounds, superior quality. Reverend Thomas Ashford, aged 70. 2. Died in 1723. A respected minister whose funeral had been attended by hundreds. His grave in the proper cemetery had been robbed 4 days after burial. His congregation had prayed over his coffin, sung hymns by candlelight, never knowing that within a week their beloved minister would become the candles that lit their next service. Elizabeth Croaker, Josiah's own wife, who died in 1694. Investigators found her entry in the earliest account book. November 8, 1694. Elizabeth, private procurement, 51 pounds yielded. He had rendered his own wife. This last discovery sent shockwaves through even the hardened investigators. They confronted Croaker about it during questioning. "You rendered your own wife," the magistrate asked, barely able to speak the words. "She was dead." Croaker said simply, "She felt nothing, and I was poor. Grief is expensive. Practicality survives. Did you love her?" Croaker seemed puzzled by the question. "Love is for the living. She was no longer there, just flesh, just material." The magistrate tried another approach. "Did you think of her when you rendered her? Did you remember your life together?" "I thought about proper temperature control," Croaker said. "I thought about getting the fat clean, free of impurities. I thought about doing the work correctly. That was my tribute to her, doing the work well." It was then that the investigators understood fully what they were dealing with. This wasn't a man driven by desperate poverty who had made a terrible choice. This wasn't someone who had started small and spiraled into horror. This was someone who had discovered an opportunity and optimized it with the same care a merchant might optimize a shipping route. Josiah Croaker had industrialized desecration, and he saw nothing wrong with it. As the investigation continued through the summer of 1729, more disturbing details emerged that transformed public horror into something approaching madness. The question everyone asked: had they personally burned Croaker's candles? Had they unknowingly participated in this desecration? The answer, for most of Salem, was yes. Almost certainly yes. Croaker's business records showed that he had sold more than 40,000 pounds of candles over 34 years. At roughly 200 candles per pound, that meant approximately 8 million individual candles. Given that his operation used an estimated 70% human tallow at its peak, that meant nearly 5.5 million candles contained human remains. 5.5 million candles, in a town of fewer than 2,000 people, in surrounding villages with combined populations of perhaps 5,000. Even accounting for candles burned in businesses, churches, and public spaces, the mathematics were inescapable. Every household had burned Croaker's candles. Many households had burned hundreds of them, and not just any candles. Croaker's account books revealed that he had been strategic about which candles received the highest quality. Tallow, the human fat that rendered the cleanest, church candles, wedding candles, baptism candles, the ceremonial candles used for the most sacred moments of life. One minister broke down during testimony when told that the baptismal candles used in his church for the past 20 years had been among Croaker's finest products, made almost entirely from human fat because, as Croaker had noted in his ledger, for holy purposes only the purest will do. Infants had been welcomed into the Christian faith by candlelight rendered from the dead. The sacred and the profaned had been inseparably merged for decades. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating discovery came from a detail in Croaker's records that investigators almost missed. In the later years, from 1720 on, Croaker had begun to keep a separate notation in his books. Next to certain procurements, he had drawn a small symbol, a circle with a cross. It took weeks to decipher its meaning. Finally, one investigator with knowledge of Chandler's marks recognized it. It was a symbol indicating a product for which specific buyers had standing orders. Croaker had been filling special requests, not randomly, not anonymously. He had been selling specific batches of candles made from specific bodies to specific customers who knew what they were purchasing. The revelation spawned a secondary investigation that would rock Salem even harder than Croaker's initial exposure. Who had known? Who had been buying human tallow candles deliberately? And why? What emerged was a network of perhaps a dozen individuals, never conclusively proven, but strongly suspected, who had sought out Croaker's special candles for purposes that ranged from the pathological to the occult. One case was documented in detail because the buyer, a woman named Margaret Corwin, confessed during the investigation. Margaret's daughter had died in 1723, aged 7, of scarlet fever. The grief had been unbearable. Margaret had heard rumors, the kind of rumors that circulated in shadows, never spoken openly, that Croaker could provide candles that contained the essence of the dead. She had approached him privately. He had confirmed that yes, for the right price, he could ensure that her next batch of candles contained material from Potter's Field harvested around the time of her daughter's burial. He couldn't guarantee it was specifically her daughter. That would have been impossible. But it would be from that time, that place, that population of the dead. Margaret had paid. She had received 20 candles. She burned one each night by her daughter's empty bed, talking to the flame as if talking to her child, believing that somehow, in some way, her daughter's physical essence was present in the light. I just wanted her back, Margaret sobbed during questioning. Even a piece of her, even that. I know it was wrong. I know it was sick. But grief makes you sick. Grief makes you willing to embrace abomination if it eases the pain for even one moment. She was never formally charged. The magistrates decided she had suffered enough, that she was a victim of Croaker's predation on the grieving. But the revelation of her testimony sparked panic. How many others had sought similar comfort? How many had knowingly, even desperately, sought out these candles? The investigation ground to a halt in August when it became clear that proving who knew what would be nearly impossible. Croaker refused to name his special clients. Grief is a private matter, he said, showing the only glimpse of something resembling restraint. I won't compound their suffering. His protection of his customers was the single almost main thing he did during the entire ordeal. Almost humane, because even this was pragmatic. He knew that naming names would make enemies of powerful people who might otherwise quietly support leniency. The trial of Josiah Croaker began on September 15, 1729, in the Salem courthouse. It lasted 6 days, unusually long for the period, but the sheer scope of the crimes demanded thorough proceedings. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Croaker's own account books, Welks's testimony, the physical evidence from the chandlery cellar, the disturbed graves, the identified victims. Expert testimony from other chandlers confirming that the quality of Croaker's candles was consistent with human tallow rendering. The defense, such as it was, consisted of Croaker's attorney arguing that while the acts were deeply disturbing, they didn't clearly violate any specific statute. There was no law explicitly prohibiting the rendering of human bodies. The bodies had been dead when taken. No living person had been harmed. The commercial fraud was minimal since the candles performed as advertised, in fact, better than advertised. It was a technical defense, legally creative and morally bankrupt. Even the attorney seemed to understand its futility. He was performing a legal obligation, ensuring Croaker received representation, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. The prosecution's closing argument, delivered by Magistrate Samuel Parris, was brief but devastating. "We stand here in a courtroom lit by candles. How many of those candles contain the rendered remains of the dead, we will never know, we can never know, and that unknowing will haunt Salem for generations. The defendant claims he harmed no living person, but look around this court. Look at the faces of those who have gathered here. Look at the families who must now wonder if they mourned by the light of their own dead. Look at the ministers who must question whether their most sacred ceremonies were illuminated by desecration, every prayer offered by candlelight, every evening meal, every child put to bed by a flame's gentle light, all potentially corrupted, all potentially transformed into unwitting participation in the violation of the dead. The defendant may not have murdered anyone, but he murdered peace, he murdered trust, he murdered the very concept of sacred rest. He transformed an entire community into unknowing participants in horror. The law may not have specific words for what he has done, but human decency does, morality does, God's law does. Find him guilty. Send the message that there are boundaries even death cannot erase, that there is a sanctity even poverty cannot strip away, that human beings, no matter how forgotten in life, retain dignity in death. Find him guilty, and perhaps we can begin to heal." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: desecration of corpses, theft of bodies, commercial fraud, violation of Christian burial practices, and, in a legal innovation for the time, crimes against human dignity. The sentence was delivered the following day. Josiah Croaker was to be hanged by the neck until dead. His property was to be seized and sold, with proceeds distributed among identified victims' families. His chandlery was to be demolished. All of his remaining candles, all of his tallow, all of his materials were to be burned. And in a detail that showed how deeply the crime had affected the magistrates, his body was not to be given Christian burial. Instead, it would be burned, the ashes scattered in the ocean, with no marker, no grave, no rest. He would be denied the very dignity he had stolen from hundreds. Croaker listened to his sentence with no visible emotion. When asked if he had any final words, he said simply, "You're destroying perfectly good tallow." Even at the end, he saw only waste. The execution took place on October 3, 1729, on Gallows Hill, the same location where the accused witches had been hanged 37 years earlier. The symbolism was deliberate. Salem was once again purging itself of evil, but this time the evil was real. More than 1,000 people gathered to witness, an enormous crowd for the time, representing not just Salem, but surrounding villages. Many came seeking closure, others came seeking justice. Some came simply to ensure that Josiah Croaker actually died, that this nightmare truly ended. The execution itself was unremarkable in its proceedings. Croaker was led to the gallows at noon. The death warrant was read. He was asked if he wished to confess his sins and beg God's forgiveness. "I have nothing to confess," he said clearly. "I regret nothing, I wasted nothing, that is my testimony." The hood was placed over his head, the noose was tightened. At 12:17 in the afternoon, the platform dropped. Josiah Croaker died within minutes, a relatively quick death, which some in the crowd found too merciful. But what happened next created a legend that would persist for centuries. As Croaker's body hung from the gallows, witnesses reported that a smell began to permeate the area. Not the expected smells of execution bowel release, the scent of death, but something else, something familiar to everyone present. The sweet, waxy smell of burning candles, of rendered tallow, the same smell that had filled the chandlery, that had clung to Croaker's clothing, that some had noticed in their own homes but never questioned. It was as if, one witness testified, as if his very body was releasing the smell of his sins, as if all those rendered dead were present at his execution, making themselves known. The smell was so strong that several people in the crowd became ill. It lingered for hours after the body was cut down, and for weeks afterward people reported smelling it in Salem, particularly at night when candles were lit. Was it real, or was it collective hysteria, a psychosomatic response to trauma? Medical experts at the time had no explanation. Modern analysis suggests it may have been real, that Croaker's clothing and even his body may have been so saturated with the smell of rendered tallow after 34 years of work that his death released it in a concentrated form, or perhaps, as many in Salem believed, it was the dead making their presence known, a reminder that some violations leave traces that can't be washed away. Croaker's body was burned that evening on the beach, as sentenced. The fire consumed everything, flesh, bone, clothing, the scaffold on which he'd hung. The ashes were scattered into the Atlantic by the grave digger Thomas Welks, in what was considered a fitting final task for the man whose testimony had exposed the horror. Welks died 3 weeks later. The official cause was given as consumption, but those who knew him said he simply lost the will to live once his confession was complete. He had been drinking himself to death for years anyway. The confession just accelerated the inevitable. You are preparing for purpose. Workers approached the building with trepidation. No one wanted to enter it again. When they finally forced themselves inside, they found that it had already been partially destroyed. During the night, someone never identified had set fire to the interior workshop. The fire hadn't spread beyond the building, but it had consumed the rendering vats, the molds, the workspace where Croaker had performed his unspeakable work. All that remained was the charred shell of the structure. Rather than rebuild or repurpose, the magistrates ordered the entire building torn down. The stone foundation was broken apart. The timbers were burned. Even the soil beneath was excavated to a depth of 3 feet and carted away to be dumped in the ocean. By November 1st, less than a month after Croaker's execution, there was no physical trace that the chandlery had ever existed. Just an empty lot that no one would purchase, no one would develop, no one wanted to remember. But the aftermath of Josiah Croaker's crimes extended far beyond physical demolition. The families of identified victims struggled with the knowledge of what had been done to their loved ones. Some found comfort in religion, in the belief that the soul transcends the body, that desecration of flesh couldn't harm the eternal spirit. Others were tormented by vivid nightmares of violation of their children, their parents, their spouses being cut apart and boiled down. Several victims' family members died by suicide in the years following the revelation. The historian Sarah Prescott notes that between 1729 and 1735, Salem experienced an abnormally high suicide rate that directly correlated with families of Croakers. Identified victims, the community itself fractured in unexpected ways. Some families refused to associate with others who had admitted to purchasing Croaker's special candles, even though the purchasers were arguably victims themselves, manipulated by grief. Old friendships dissolved. Business partnerships ended. Churches split when congregations couldn't agree on how to purify their sacred spaces that had been lit by desecrated light. In 1730, Salem's town council passed the most comprehensive burial protection laws in colonial America. Every grave, including paupers' graves, had to be registered with specific details. Grave watchers were hired to monitor new burials for the first 30 days. Chandlers were required to prove the source of all tallow through affidavits from slaughterhouses. Disturbing a grave became a capital crime. These laws, born from Salem's trauma, spread throughout Massachusetts and eventually influenced burial laws across America. In a bitter irony, Josiah Croaker's crimes led to protections for the dead that might have prevented his crimes in the first place. But what of the candles themselves, the thousands of candles still in Salem homes when Croaker was exposed? This became one of the most psychologically challenging aspects of the aftermath. The official order was clear. All candles were to be surrendered to authorities for destruction. But compliance was inconsistent. Some families burned their entire supply immediately, choosing to sit in darkness rather than risk burning the dead. Others, where more practical candles were expensive, winter was coming, and poverty didn't pause for moral crisis. How do you know which candles are tainted? Croaker had mixed human tallow with animal tallow. His earlier candles, before he became bold, might have contained only traces of human fat. Later candles might have been pure human tallow. There was no way to test them, no way to know. Records suggest that thousands of Croaker's candles remained in use for months after his death, perhaps longer. People made pragmatic calculations. The dead were already gone. The violation had already occurred. Destroying the candles wouldn't undo anything, might as well use them. This pragmatism horrified the more devout members of the community, who saw it as continued participation in desecration. Arguments erupted. Neighbors reported each other for keeping Croaker's candles. The magistrates, overwhelmed, eventually stopped enforcing the surrender order. They couldn't search every home. They couldn't force compliance. In the end, the decision was left to individual conscience. And individual conscience, as always, varied widely. The long-term effects on Salem were profound and unexpected. The town's economy, already fragile, suffered as its reputation spread. The candle horror of Salem became known throughout the colonies. Visitors avoided the town. Trade relationships were damaged. For decades, Salem was associated not with the witch trials, but with something worse, proven horror rather than mass hysteria. The population declined. Between 1730 and 1750, nearly a quarter of Salem's residents moved away. Some couldn't bear the weight of living in a place so associated with violation. Others left for practical reasons. Economic opportunity was better elsewhere, away from Salem's tainted reputation. But perhaps the most lasting impact was psychological. A generation of children grew up knowing that the candlelight of their early years had been literally fueled by the dead. They grew up aware that their parents had unknowingly participated in horror, that their most sacred memories, bedtime prayers, holiday celebrations, church services, were all potentially corrupted. Reverend Jonathan Ellis, who conducted extensive interviews with survivors in 1760, noted a common theme: a profound distrust of the ordinary. If candles, something so mundane, so essential, so trusted, could harbor such horror, what else might be hiding in plain sight? What other trusted things might secretly be wrong? This anxiety manifested in various ways. Some Salem residents developed obsessive behaviors around candle use, insisting on making their own tallow from personally slaughtered animals. Others refused to use candles at all, relying on fireplaces and oil lamps, even when candles would be more practical. Children developed phobias of candlelight. Ministers struggled with congregations who couldn't pray in spaces illuminated by candles, no matter how much they were assured the candles were clean. Croaker stole our ability to trust the ordinary. One survivor told Ellis, "He made the familiar monstrous, and that's a theft you can never fully recover from." In 1768, 39 years after Croaker's execution, an unexpected discovery reignited public interest in the case. During renovation of an old merchant's house, workers found a hidden compartment containing a journal belonging to Josiah Croaker himself. It had been hidden there by unknown means, possibly by someone who had stolen it from his residence before the authorities could seize all his property. The journal covered the years 1712 through 1728. It provided a chilling window into Croaker's mindset and revealed details that the trial had never uncovered. Most disturbing was a section where Croaker discussed his philosophy regarding his work. January 15, 1724, spoke with Reverend Morton today about the nature of the soul. He preached that the body is merely a vessel, that the true self departs at death, that flesh is temporary and spirit eternal. I find great comfort in his theology. It confirms what I have always known, that the body after death is no more sacred than the carcass of a cow. We are all meat. The only question is whether that meat serves a purpose or rots uselessly. I choose purpose. I choose utility. I choose light over darkness in the most literal sense possible. If God objects to my work, let him strike me down. Let him deny me customers. Let him make the candles burn poorly. But he does none of these things. Instead, my business thrives, ministers praise my candles, families rely on them, the market rewards me. Is this not divine approval? Is this not proof that I am correct, that the pious horror of desecration is mere superstition, mere emotional weakness in the face of practical reality? The journal revealed other disturbing details. Croaker had experimented with different rendering techniques to improve quality, noting which bodies produced the best tallow younger victims, those who died of quick causes rather than wasting diseases, those with more body fat. He had occasionally recognized people among the body's whelks, brought him neighbors, customers, acquaintances. This never troubled him. I rendered Margaret Hoskins on March 12, 1719. He wrote, "She had purchased candles from me just the week before her death. There is a symmetry to this that pleases me." He had been planning to expand his operation, possibly franchising his methods to chandlers in other towns. "The supply of dead is endless," he wrote. "Every town has paupers. Every community has forgotten graves. The opportunity is vast." The journal ended abruptly in March 1728, a year before his exposure. The final entry was brief. "A child has been having nightmares about my candles. Her mother tells people, 'Foolish superstition will pass,' but if it does not, I have prepared. I have hidden records. I have contingencies. The work is too important to be stopped by hysteria." The discovery of the journal reopened old wounds. Families who had begun to heal found themselves traumatized anew. The detailed descriptions of Croaker's process, his complete lack of remorse, his plans to expand, it all made real again what many had tried to forget. The journal was eventually sealed by authorities and placed in a restricted archive. It remains there today, available only to serious researchers with documented scholarly purposes. Most who read it report the same reaction, a profound disquiet, a sense that they've glimpsed a mind fundamentally alien to normal human empathy. The empty lot where Croaker's chandlery once stood remained undeveloped for more than a century. Local legend held that it was cursed, that nothing good could be built where such horror had occurred. Several attempts to develop the property ended in strange accidents, financial ruin, or psychological breaks among the workers. In 1867, a group of Salem residents finally purchased the lot for a specific purpose. they erected a memorial to Croaker's victims. A simple granite stone with 347 names, all the identified victims, and beneath them the words, "And 258 forgotten souls who rest here in memory, if not in body." The memorial stands today, though few visitors to Salem know its story. Tour guides generally skip it, focusing instead on the witch trial sites that draw more tourist interest. But on certain nights, locals say, you can still smell something sweet and waxy near the memorial. Most dismiss it as imagination, as the power of suggestion. But some know better. The story of Josiah Croaker and his candles made from human fat remains one of the most disturbing cases in American history, not because of its violence, he killed no one, but because of what it reveals about vulnerability, about trust, about the invisible atrocities that can occur in the spaces we don't think to look. But questions remain, questions that haunt scholars and descendants. How many victims were there really? 347 documented, but Croaker's records began in 1695. What about the years before? His father ran the chandlery before him. Did the practice begin even earlier? Some researchers suggest the true count could exceed 500. Who were the special customers, beyond Margaret Corwin, who knowingly purchased Croaker's tainted candles? The investigation was deliberately inconclusive, protecting the powerful. Names were whispered but never proven. To this day, certain Salem families carry suspicions never spoken openly about their ancestors' possible involvement. What happened to the candles that were never surrendered? Thousands of candles remained in circulation. They were burned, their smoke released, their wax dripped and cooled. Some may still exist. Colonial America candles are occasionally found in old homes during renovations. How many contain human tallow, we will never know. The horror may still be burning somewhere, in an antique shop, a museum, a collector's home. Perhaps these questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is part of the story's power, the understanding that horror doesn't always reveal itself completely, that some violations leave mysteries as well as scars. To this day, Fisher Street in Salem, where the chandlery once stood, has an unusual characteristic that several studies have documented but never explained. Candles burn differently there. They burn faster, with more smoke, with a sweet smell that residents say is subtly wrong. Scientific analysis shows no environmental factors that would cause this. The wax is standard, the atmospheric conditions are normal, yet the effect persists. And on silent nights in Salem, when fog rolls in from the harbor, when the air grows thick and still, when darkness settles over the old colonial streets, people still report a sweetness in the air, a waxy scent that reminds them of candles burning, of tallow rendering, of something that shouldn't be but somehow is. Most dismiss it as imagination, as the mind playing tricks, as the lingering power of suggestion in a town with too much dark history. But some know better. Some understand that certain violations leave traces that never fully fade, that the dead, when treated with such profound disrespect, don't simply disappear. They linger, they wait, they make themselves known in subtle ways, in smells, in dreams, in the uneasy feeling that something in the ordinary is wrong. Josiah Croaker's candles may have burned out long ago, but their light, or rather, their darkness still flickers at the edges of Salem's history, still melting, still dripping, still casting shadows that no amount of time can fully erase. If this journey through one of history's most disturbing violations resonated with you, if you find yourself lying awake tonight thinking about the trusted things that might harbor hidden horror, if you're questioning how many everyday objects carry secrets we'll never uncover, then this channel has more uncomfortable truths waiting in the shadows. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the stories that history tries to forget, the ones that reveal not dramatic violence, but quiet, systematic, hidden horror. The ones that show us how evil doesn't always announce itself, but sometimes simply melts away in plain sight, leaving us unknowing participants in atrocity. Leave a like if this account disturbed something deeper than your sense of history, if it made you question the ordinary, the trusted, the mundane objects that fill our lives with barely a thought. And in the comments, I want to know, if you had been a resident of Salem in 1729, if you had just learned that you'd been burning the dead in your home for years, unknowingly, participating in desecration every night when you lit your candles, how would you live with that knowledge? Would you see yourself as a victim of Croaker's crime, or as an unwitting participant? Where is the line between ignorance and complicity? Between being deceived and bearing responsibility? These aren't just historical questions. In our modern world, how many products do we use without knowing their true origins? How many everyday objects involve suffering, exploitation, or violation that occurs out of our sight? How many times are we unknowing participants in things that would horrify us if we understood them fully? Until next time, remember, the most terrifying stories aren't the ones about monsters who look like monsters. They're about the ones who look like Chandlers, who perform ordinary trades, who hide horror in plain sight. They're about how evil can burn in every window for 30 years, and no one notices until a child has nightmares. And perhaps that's the real darkness we're afraid of, not the monster in the shadows, but the one in the candlelight we trusted. The one that was always there, burning, melting, lighting our way. Tell us where you're watching from, and blow out your candles before you sleep.